Well, welcome to a second edition of the Week in Sports Cars on the Marshall Pruitt podcast, brought to you by the fabulous people at Cooper Tyres and the equally fabulous people at the Justice Brothers. Yes, this is Graham Goodwin actually introducing the show, and that's because Marshall Pruitt is melting. He is melting in a post-COTA spring training from IndyCar. Well, by the sound of it, MP, very heavy cold. I'm just over mine post-Bathurst. You're suffering, I'm afraid, post-Texas. This motorsport lark is just not good for us, brother.
The thing is, Graham, it was absolutely free. No one charged me for it. It was a gift from Circuit of the Americas. I mean, you want to talk about Texan hospitality. Here's living proof. Yes, so I'm sitting here with my nose just dripping like mad, and my chest, I'll be starting a new career as a Barry White impersonator, hopefully. So, yeah, just dealing with it and figured, why don't we have Graham introduce part 2 of this week's The Week in Sports Cars. So, we've got a bunch of great questions left, my friend. And since my voice is the, is the front-engine Nissan GTR Nismo LMP1 between the two of us, why don't I play the man who is serving up questions to you, by and large, so that you can put your functioning voice and functioning brain to good use for our dear listeners. So with that said, knowing that we got into IMSA a fair bit last time, we're just going to jump around again, but why don't we do that by kicking off with our ACO, WEC, and Asian Le Mans Series questions, starting with our pal, 4S GTE, who says, what is the extent of Ferrari's factory involvement in the Competizione GT beyond factory drivers? More specifically, what is the extent of their involvement with AF Courses, WC effort, and Risi's IMSA effort? Is there any indication on what the next generation LMP2 will look like, et cetera, et cetera? So why don't we field the Ferrari and then also next gen P2?
Well, next gen P2, I think, is an easy one. It's going to be very like this gen P2 because, frankly, at this point, not very much wrong with that concept, other than the fact they will need, if Hypercar is successful, to slow down the LMP2 cars a tad, certainly a handful of seconds. So don't expect to see much that is very different from what we're currently seeing, certainly in the next generation. I think if we're going to see anything spectacularly different, you can look beyond that. They're still selling cars. There will be, I'm sure, an opportunity for an error update for the less successful of the chassis, in other words, anything that's not an Orica, but don't expect to see anything wildly different in terms of the look of the cars, just the overall performance levels. As for the Ferrari efforts, I think I'm right, MP, and I'll let you dive in on the Risi side at the end of this answer. Distinct difference between what goes on with the WEC AF Corsa effort, that is a GTE Pro effort, full factory drivers, and with some factory backing from Ferrari for that effort. It is the only effort under AF Corsa's mighty extending arms that is anything other than a customer program. So that is effectively a Ferrari funded global GT effort. The Risi Competizione, yes, a bit of support in terms of the Ferrari factory drivers that come his way, but make no mistake, Giuseppe Risi is a very proud Ferrari privateer and does have to go and find the funding to actually make that work. There is, I'm sure, a little bit of assistance from the various partners for the Ferrari factory efforts, but it is a very different kettle of marine wildlife for the Risi Competizione efforts compared to the AF Corsa efforts. So that's as simple as I think it actually gets. Effectively, full Ferrari GTE efforts on the WEC side, not so for IMSA.
Well, you covered off both perfectly, so why don't we move down to... Let's go to Rafael Place. I apologize if I got your last name wrong. Rafael, if you aren't aware, I am also known as the last name assassin. Haven't had too many opportunities, Graham, to mangle people's last names of late.
Oh, we'll get there.
Yeah, I mean, that is one thing. Certainly, reliability is strong in that area. Raphael says, I was watching the IndyCar test at COTA and saw that they put a wall in front of the F1 pits. In Sebring, the WC race, will they just use an American-style pit, or they have FIA-style pits?
I've not actually had a close look at the Sebring pit lane yet. Know where it is. It's down the back of the Ormond Straight, or the inside rather, driver's right of the Ormond Straight. There does seem to be a pit wall. But whether or not that's going to mean that we don't get a wall in front of the pit lane, I don't yet know. I strongly suspect it does, because Raphael, when we raced at COTA with the WEC, you may or may not remember that pit wall, the US-style pit wall, was removable. And in fact, we had an extended, I think it was a 2-hour break, MP, where they came and craned out the concrete partitions to change over from IMSA, because, of course, we did have years where it shared the bill with the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship and the WEC. So standard US pit wall for the IMSA cars and pit garages for the WEC. So my guess is that we're going to see something that is rather more akin to a Western-style pit lane rather than IMSA-style pit wall, because there are going to be two completely separate pit lanes. WEC down the driver's right, the Ormond Straight, and of course IMSA in the traditional pit lane that we all know and love after turn 17.
And I think this is going to remain one of the solid mysteries until we see photos of it or get absolute clarity. I know that a friend of mine at COTA had mentioned the only clear shot, Dustin Hesseltine. Dustin mentioned the only clear shot he'd seen was from a parasailing video that one of the former Starworks drivers happened to shoot, and was just, again, parasailing near Sebring, and there were a couple of angles where young Mr. Podolicchio, I believe, was the one who was doing the parasailing, and we could see just a little tiny bit. So, anyways, or I'm sorry, Alex Popow, I should say. I apologize. Alex Popow was doing the parasailing, so, and got to see a little tiny bit, but it wasn't enough for me to get a full understanding of what was happening.
Well, we'll have a conversation with some of the guys who've been testing out there. They'll have at least a clearer clue of what civil engineering has been done in that kind of area. We do know the teams are going to be housed in standard double awnings. No trailers for the WC teams, of course. They'll be operating out of containers at Sebring, but there will be standard double awnings for each of the teams, and I'm guessing it'll be a very similar open paddock to what we'd normally have everywhere other than the Le Mans 24 Hours.
And I did speak with our friend Mike Hull, managing director for Chip Ganassi Racing, who mentioned they will be at Sebring next week with their IMSA Ford GTLM program. So I might see if I can ask Mike to wander over, snap a few shots, and finally answer this question we've gotten a few times and have yet to be able to answer. Let's see. Let's go to Cookie Monster FL. Gentlemen, cheers as always. Just wanted to say I attended my first test at Sebring, thus seeing my team for the first time in person. I'll just say this, Toyota and Sebring are a fantastic combination. The 12 hours can't come soon enough. Graham, throwbacks are a big trend these days. If my imaginary scenario existed, Toyota have announced throwback liveries for Le Mans this year, and you get to choose. Which two liveries would you pick for the factory squad?
Ooh, there have been some corkers. They tend to be kind of quite brash and bold, the bright yellows, but the bright red for me was always the thing. And those with longer memories might remember that Toyota, whilst they first appeared on a track at a WEC race with a photo call on the way down to testing at Spa in 2012, that car appeared in a photo call alongside the Audi in red. By the time we actually saw the cars for the first time in competition at the test for Le Mans, they were white and blue and stayed that way until the rather standard black, red, and white liveries we've seen them in more recently. I'd love to see them back in the red livery that we saw in the days of the Toyota GT1 in the late 90s. I thought that livery, particularly the 1999 livery, with more red rather than the red and white stripes, I thought suited those cars very well, and I think it would suit these cars well too. I do like the throwback liveries. I will say this, I'm becoming slightly concerned that some of the throwback liveries we're seeing for some of these teams, I'd like to see a little bit more risk taken with some of the liveries we're seeing in international competition. I do love retro liveries. I do love the tribute liveries. I'd like to see a few more convincing liveries for full seasons across Europe, and for that matter, some of the liveries in North America as well. Porsche in particular. Yes, I'm looking at you guys. I've been a little uninspired with some of Porsche's global liveries in recent years, and it would be good to see liveries appearing on their cars that perhaps we'd like to see again in 20 to 30 years' time.
I will just mention this, which isn't about liveries, but it was just a random observation, having taken a look at some of the video that Brian, Mr. Lanky Turtle, happened to shoot of the test with the Toyotas zipping around Sebring. And having not seen them since Audi and Porsche left, and having not seen the Toyotas up close in this downturned BOP state, it was a little disappointing, if not a lot disappointing. And I'm not just complaining for the sake of complaining. It's not really a complaint, just an observation that having seen bad, crazy, fast LMP1 cars, in this decade at Sebring, and having seen them up close at Le Mans or Silverstone or wherever else, it was my first time just seeing video of a car like this TS050 at Sebring with a lot of performance shackles in place, and boy, the absence of explosive power off of corners and just the elapsed time between corners, really noticeable. So that's the only thing that stood out to me, is like, oh, well, again, it's obvious, you expect it, but just having seen it was like, oh boy, yeah, this isn't very fun.
Would say that what they were doing in that first test was actually just to verify some of their sim data and verify setup. So I don't think they were going for raw performance in the first test there. They've got a big endurance test to come. There's a further WEC test prior to race week in March. So I'd be interested to see what we actually see. Bear in mind, this could be an interesting moment, couldn't it? What we've got is, Toyotas that are not that far different, actually, MP, in terms of the performance than perhaps when you last saw them in the raw in Europe. But of course, then DPIs with the wick turned up a little bit this time, and on their Michelin rubber, I think there's going to be some bragging rights up for grabs. And don't count out either, by the way, particularly the Rebellions when we actually get out to the Sebring track. Of course, North America has been a happy hunting ground for Rebellion racing in recent years. I think some of the headlines we're going to see are going to be about the relative times between, the big boys in the LMP1 class, for that matter, a pumped-up LMP2 class in the FIWC, and IMSA's finest in the DPIs. Boy, oh boy, in an era where people are being asked to take sides, that could be a moment, couldn't it?
Yeah, and I'll just add this in just for a little point of clarity, that a team that is testing simulation, trying to correlate their sim data and set up information from all that, they would not be running at anything less than 100%, because no team actually works on setups for cars that are less than operating at 100% in qualifying or race trim. So in order to correlate, running around off the pace does absolutely nothing for them. So whatever we saw the team running would have been them pushing the car to try and match the same virtual testing numbers that they were expecting to see to verify if they were accurate. So
I completely agree, MP. I tell you what, I saw Lanky Turtle stuff as well, and I agree with you, slightly underwhelming. Less underwhelming, have a look at Sebastian Buemi's Twitter feed. A couple of clips that Sebastian actually took from trackside, including one major moment for one of the cars, in fact, the one car that was running out of turn one. At that point, they were pushing, looked to be getting into darkness at that point. So I wonder whether the wick was turned up when the cameras were turned off.
Let's go to our pal Right Turn Lover. 2 questions from good old RTL. Hey, wait a minute. Maybe this is the television station, folks, and we just didn't ever put that together. Right Turn Lover asks, do we know which team is going to run G-Drive's ELMS program? And as there's only one G-Drive in ELMS, will there be another one in the WEC?
Well, number one, yes, we do know it will be TDS Racing again, the team that took, of course, the ELMS title. ELMS program is locked in for the number 26 car. We have not been told whether or not there is going to be another G-Drive liveried car, as of course there has been for the last couple of years in the LMS. I believe we might, I don't think it's yet done, we might see that very same team actually turn up in the WEC for 2019-20 as well. So it may well be that by the end of the season they're running a double program. The big change for them this year is the signing of Wunderkind and still silver rated Joop van Utrecht, part of the LMP3 winning squad, of course, for RRM Sports in the ELMS, steps up to LMP2 with Roman Rusinov and Jean-Eric Verne. And what little I have been told from early season training, which includes some time, by the way, at Sebring, is Mr. Van Utrecht might be giving Mr. Verne a little bit of trouble in terms of who's going to be the boss in terms of times. Let's keep an eye out and see whether or not that one continues. The other interesting thing, by the way, is that is a team that so far has not declared whether or not they're going Dunlop or Michelin, certainly as far as the provisional entry list for the LMS is concerned. So no idea yet on a second G-Drive livery car in the LMS. It might happen, but watch this space for when we start to get some conversations going about what we're going to see in the FIWEC, and in particular what happens with TDS Racing's entries, plural there, because I think we're going to see some changes.
I think we might also be able to do a hashtag nickname here for Joop van Utrecht. We just call him Vowel Boy, because I think his entire name was intentionally formed out of nothing but vowels. So I might be off just a little bit. But
if only there was an A in there, he'd have them all five covered. There you go.
We also will stick here with Right Turn Live, who says, any insights into or speculation about why the WC's ever-present Proton team owner Christian Reed's seat in the Proton car for Sebring so far is occupied by one of the TBA sisters. What's going on there?
No, I've not. I did try to call the team. The phone wasn't being picked up at the workshop when I rang after we saw the entry list, but I will try and follow up with Chris as soon as I possibly can. I hope that we do see Christian Reed continue. He would be the only ever-present left in the WEC with Andre Lotre sitting out the Sebring race. That would leave Christian as the only guy who's taken part in every single WEC race since 2012. There are a couple of other possibilities. We've seen confirmation as well that the number 88 car at the Le Mans 24 Hours will again be branded with and crewed by driver from the D-Station Japanese Super GT squad will be partnering again with Dempsey Proton with the 88 car. The same team, by the way, that was announced this morning as a new partner for Aston Martin for the first time since 2014 in Super GT, with Darren Turner joining the two regular drivers there for the Fuji 500. But no news yet as to what's going on. My guess is it could very well be that Christian is just turning up there and they've just not yet finally filed the final entry for that. But there could be another couple of bits and pieces in the mix for that one. So I hope he does turn out. I've got a lot of time for Christian. I know it's been a rough old time for Dempsey Proton with the fuel rig debacle that actually has plagued their season, and correctly so, by the way, plagued their season. But I still have a lot of time for the man whose family efforts have brought a huge number of cars to a huge number of series over my professional lifetime.
Graham, I will admit to being thoroughly shocked that among all the teams in GTE, that Proton did not pick up the phone between 3 and 5 seconds faster than all the rest. So that is a giant corker right there that we need to get figured out. Let's go to our pal Robert Stevens. Any word from Krone Racing? Seems odd not to see them in any series entry list.
And by the way, Robert, you can be guaranteed that Marshall is not on form, because if any other week, if he wasn't feeling as rough as he did, your name bar now would be Step Hens. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. Heard nothing at all from Tracy and co. Wasn't surprised to see that didn't appear, or reappear rather, on the ELMS entry. Is this going to be the year where we finally see that long run of consecutive Le Mans appearances broken for Tracy? It was not a good year for them in the European Le Mans Series. They had a couple of good runs, one at Spa that was ruined by someone else's accident, I'm afraid, with Nick Johnson running well at that point. But I wonder whether or not this is the end of the run for Tracy Crone. It's been a long time for the pair of them with Nick Johnson together. I think, is it 12 or 13, I think, at Le Mans consecutively. Beats finally the run of a couple of the Audi boys a couple of years ago. But no word whatsoever from Tracy as to whether or not we will see him in ACO rules racing or SRI rules racing or indeed anything else at the moment. So we keep you posted, Robert.
All righty, Mr. Stephens. Let's go to Gary Quarterman. Says, in your opinion, what do you think regarding Baikalus, their latest press release? They will be back at Spa. We did see
they will be back. They will be back at Spa. Announced, actually, it might well have been while you're actually going off to see your doc, that they are now confirmed, having just signed a deal with Gibson. So the Gibson V8, the 4.5-litre GL V8, will be in the back of the Baikalus testing, and then in time, it's going to be tight, but in time for Spa is the prediction from Gibson. And yes, we will see a CLM Gibson. So we've had a CLM AER, we've had a CLM Nismo. Now it's going to be the Gibson V8. So they will move, I'm trying to think, for the first time, to a normally aspirated LMP1 engine in the back of that car. I'll have to go back and have a think about that one, but I think that's right. But Gary, by now you'll have seen Daily Sports Car breaking that up at 5 p.m. UK time, that Gibson, it will be a Baikalus Gibson. They will be back, and you'll have seen on the web as well, Baikalus talking as well about the fact that they will be progressing their hypercar plans as well. A bit of an update from me on that one, I hope, in the coming days about where things currently stand with a number of those efforts.
And as someone who grew up listening to and just worshiping the comedian George Carlin, I do have to admit that whenever someone uses the phrasing, in your opinion, or in your own words, I am taken back to one of George's various routines. So compared to my opinion or your opinion, in the opinion of Abraham Lincoln, what do you think he would feel regarding the Baikalus team and their latest press releases, boss? So sorry, Gary, I'm not actually saying anything negative. I just, whenever I see in your opinion, I always immediately think, is there another opinion I should offer? Mary Curie, in Mahatma Gandhi, what would he think about the Baikalus team? But let's continue with the dear old dentist entrant, Colin Baikalus. Hank Podzamek says, has Mr. Collis ever had a team with a proper racing budget? I mean, we don't know the numbers, Graham, right? But we can definitely say that by looking at things, the best they might have ever had was when they got themselves into a then, year-old or 2-year-old Audi R10 at Le Mans, which was a proper racing vehicle. I would just say that, at least externally, not knowing what their budgets happen to be, pretty much everything else they've done has looked like a team trying to do too much on too little and falling short. But maybe you disagree.
And can you remember who drove one of those cars in year 2 at Le Mans with the team?
What I'm trying to think. Narain Karthikeyan was one of them.
No, that was year 1.
Year 1.
Year 1, year 2.
Christophe Bouchou.
Christophe Bouchou and Scott Tucker. And I seem to recall being told at the time, now that is 2011-ish?
Something like that.
I seem to remember being told that the figure paid for that car, for that race, was a princely 1.75 million.
That's all. Hey, good for Audi. Good for Audi. I would have only charged 1.6. I mean, we're talking a bargain of a lifetime. Let's go to SRA Smoking Puppy 841. Sometime, Graham, we need to do a special episode of the Week in Sports Cars where we ask folks to explain their screen names.
Absolutely.
Hank Podzamek, you're all good, Hank. We rightly assume that's your full name. SRA Smoking Puppy 841. There has
It's
to be a story behind that. And Floodman
it's
11, Bucksock. I mean, there's.
I always look at SRA Smoking Puppy, and it always reminds me, I don't know why, of some kind of gun control animal cruelty freak. But it's all a bit weird. He's asking me, do you think Speed Factory will make any LMS appearances in 2019? Who do I think most deserves to take the remaining Le Mans entries? Were there any surprises for me on either entry list, the LMS or indeed for the WC, and what does it mean for Genesis LMP1 program? Right, so let's get through those in quick order. Speed Factory will be disappointed, and I think they're correct to be disappointed not to be on that list. I thought they took a big step forward last year with their LMP3 program. Whether or not they retain the love and we see them on the Michelin Le Mans Cup list, I think, is an open question. Let's wait and see what actually happens with that. Who do I think most deserves to take the remaining Le Mans entries? I think that's an incredibly interesting question, and I think it comes down now to a very straight choice for the ACO. Do they go for the short-term money? Do they take the factory coin, and do they take every factory GT car they possibly can to go to Le Mans and give us an awesome GT Pro battle, which we were sort of robbed of last year with the safety car issue, which by the looks of things has been sorted for this year. Stories, I'm writing stories at the moment for DSC and Racer on exactly that subject. Do we get that again, that opportunity, or do they just take the edge off that and trim a couple of cars out of that and give us an awesome LMP2 field? Because at the moment, the big problem is that the numbers don't quite stack up for allowing every LMP2 team that reasonably might expect to be in the mix there from the European Le Mans Series. And by who might reasonably expect to be in there, I'm talking about teams with at least 2 years, 2 seasons under their belts in the LMS in competitive trim. If the IMSA GTLMs come, that will mean 3 or 4 of those teams can't. Now, think about that for a moment in the context of, say, for instance, the Rolex 24 Hours at Daytona. Could you imagine for a single second IMSA turning down a team in the prototype class? I can't, is the honest answer. So I think we have to think about it in that kind of context. I think we also have to think about it in a context of the greater interest in terms of the ACO's business plan moving forward around their product, the European Le Mans Series and the FIWEC. And this is where I know you and I have had a spirited debate in the past, MP. At some point, and particularly when you're in, well, extended transition, you've got to, as the rights owner for those properties, start thinking about your business plan and whether or not actually you can afford at that point to put short-term cash gain, which is why you would be expecting the additional factory cars, ahead of longer-term retention of customers that might be with you for 3, 5, 7 years to come. And I think that is the nightmare that is at the moment haunting the ACO. They have communicated this extraordinarily badly. I think that much is clear. I think that much has been made very clear to them by the likes of you and I, MP, by the likes of the fan base that have been asking those questions. I think they're probably quite lucky we don't have a race meeting anytime soon. Otherwise, I think there might be a reasonable communications siege on this front. But that, I think, is what's going on right at the moment. Were there any surprises for me on either entry list? No. Oh, the big surprise was that we didn't get the 50. That was a major surprise. On the LMS list, no. There were a couple more GT cars than I was expecting to see. That was good news. The lack of the Ginettas you also comment on. I think that actually is disappointing. I would have liked to have seen one of those cars. I've gone on the record previously to say, much as you can point all sorts of fingers at all sorts of people here, I just think that is an engineering effort that has been downright unlucky. They didn't get the customers they wanted in the early part of the program. The customer they did want, they did actually end up with, commercially let them down rather badly. This is not an issue directly of their making. The way the regulations are couched means it's been terrifically difficult for them to claw back that lost ground. They'd done that. They'd got I believe, control of those entries. And I strongly suspect that what you're going to see on March the 1st is a Ginetta LMP1 in a very sad place indeed, which is on the reserve list. I think that is a real shame, and I hope that that's not the end of that program.
And please excuse the mild delay in my picking things up when Graham's done, because I'm hitting the mute button, so you hear as little of me sniffling and just sounding like more of a bigger mess than I usually am. Let's see, let's go to our pal Floodman 11. On the ELMS entry list, it makes me sad that the high-class racing outfit have changed from the Dallara chassis to the Oreca. Can you shed any light into the reasons behind the swap? High class were really impressive in that Dallara in the 2017 season, and as one of the few teams getting results on a non-Oreca chassis, I'm mournful that we've lost another aspect of potential variety at the front of the ELMS P2 field.
It's a great question. Let me give you a little bit of background on High Class, because there's reasons to be even more respectful of that team, little Danish team, than perhaps you realise. You'll be familiar with the S&P Racing LMP2 efforts the last 2 years in the LMS. For the first year, a year in which they scored a dominant race win at Paul Ricard, that car was the spare car for High Class Racing. So in other words, without High Class Racing, S&P Racing wouldn't have been in the game. Last year, we had the AVF by Adrian Valles team racing, and at times in the hands of Hugo, sorry, I'm trying to think of his first name, Chavez. That car went very well as well, was running in top 3 positions until Mr. Tereshchenko got in the car and basically threw it at the wall repeatedly. But the AVF by Adrian Valles was the spare car from High Class Racing, another team that got their start in LMP2 because High Class had invested in the product. Stephen Kilby from Daily Sports Car wrote both for DSC and for Racer at the end of last year that he was tracking the fact that the High Class team were out testing, well, the Dallaras, but were testing with Carlin Motorsports, with a young man, Jack Manchester. The reason Jack is in the Carlin car, which is on the LMS list, by the way, is it's the only chassis he can fit in. He's quite tall, and it's the only chassis that he can actually fit in. My understanding is that Carlin were persuaded, High Class were persuaded to run that test with the hope and expectation that the Carlin deal would come along with that a little further down the line. That didn't happen, and that didn't happen for reasons which are not yet absolutely clear, so I'm not quite going to name names, but suffice to say that Carlin now have possession of what was the S&P Racing chassis, their new chassis last year, and not the High Class chassis. In the meantime, High Class have been crunching the data and had realised that they were basically batting in the LMS with one hand tied behind their back, with a Dallara chassis that they believe was underperforming, have ordered and now taken delivery of 2 Oreca 07 chassis, one to race, one as a spare, and who knows where that might end up just in case, because that clearly forms part of their commercial package. And I am told that in testing, they were significantly quicker in the Oreca than they ever have been in the Dallara. That, Floodman, mate, is the answer. We have one Dallara chassis left in the ELMS. On occasion, we have had 4. And I think in this instance, it is absolutely performance-driven. We've still got one, by the way, another team that actually holds two cars in the hands of Racing Team Netherlands in the WEC. I don't expect that will be a Dallara effort by the 2019-2020 season either. I think that Dallara LMP2 program is in some very considerable trouble.
And let's go to Bucksock next, and that is a lovely question that stays in the LMP2 realm, but definitely tries to get into an area that I'll admit I'm a little bit fuzzy on as well. Any news on what made Signatech Alpine switch to Michelin's, and that we might now have more cars running on the Michelin's and the Dunlops in P2 at Sebring, and might that then also be the case for Le Mans? And then also mentioned that, thought about it some more, it seems like Dunlop is disappearing altogether in the WEC. Any signs that other teams are looking at new or different tire manufacturers, someone other than Michelin, despite the fact that Michelin's doing such a great job with their tires?
Certainly not aware. We've had other tyre manufacturers having a look at LMP2 previously. I know certainly that Pirelli in previous times were taking a close look. That didn't come to fruition. There were others too that took a bit of a sniff around it. But I think, to be honest with you, the competition from Dunlop and Michelin was just a little bit too rich for their blood. As for the Michelin versus Dunlop item, strikes me, and I think it's a mistake. We've already seen that the hypercar rules are heading towards a spec tyre for the new LMP1. Don't particularly like it, understand why it's happening, don't particularly like it. The end of last season, we saw a couple of teams, principally United Autosport, switching to the Michelin tyre in the LMS, having seen that Panis Barthez competition with their Ligier chassis were squeezing very good performance of the Michelins. And indeed, United Autosports ended the season on the up with race wins. That's clearly had an effect in terms of the marketability of Michelin in the ELMS, particularly where they're now going to be the numerically dominant tyre manufacturer. It clearly as well appears to have been the case that Signatech have had their head turned as well. There is, though, a fact to take into account. Oh, and by the way, we should say, I've no doubt whatsoever that the performance and endurance testing that's been taking place in order for the switch to be made in IMSA has been a big part of that. I know, for instance, that the day after the finale for the LMS at Portimao, there was at least one team, and I suspect two teams, actually testing IMSA LMP2 tyres on ELMS cars the day after the season. There is, however, a balancing factor to come into play, and that's going to be interesting to see how that one plays out, which is that means that Michelin, because they brought out effectively their final permitted tyre right at the end of the season, that leaves Dunlop with an available one evolution still to come. They're allowed to present a set number of tyres for a given period of homologation. So Dunlop still has one bullet in the gun, and it'll be interesting to see what happens when and where they decide to actually roll that one out. Got to catch up with that one with our friends from Birmingham who look after this programme. Tyres are built elsewhere now, but still managed from Birmingham in the UK. Got to catch up with them, and actually that is a call I plan on making on Monday.
All right, let's take one more from the WEC ELMS and Asian Le Mans Series category before we step into some IMSA and whatever else piques our fancy to close, since we're coming up at almost 40 minutes into this 1 hour episode of The Week in Sports Cars, presented to you by Cooper Tires and the Justice Brothers. And I'll throw this one at you, which it touches on something we just had a moment ago, but I really like the angle here. This comes in from Dustin Monroe, who says the Le Mans entry list includes 3 entries for Dempsey Proton. Is there any update on the hack of the data logging system, and why would a team that was excluded from last year's race and the championship be rewarded with a 3rd entry? Does this send a bit of a mixed message? There's also a little bit of stuff to clear up in there because we still have the super season going, but...
Absolutely. Dustin, you're actually wrong, but you're right. There are actually 4 cars for Dempsey Proton or Proton competition, which are the same exact team. They get the 2 for their full season WEC entries. They get 1, you're quite right, for the win, which they retain, by the way, despite losing the points. They keep the win at Le Mans, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And they get the 4th, the Proton competition entry, for winning LMP2 in the European Le Mans Series with another of their 911 RSRs. They own 4 of those cars, by the way. So the answer on why they get that place is there was, I gather, no data that could sustain a position with the official results having been announced and published, that could sustain that the issue for the fuel fill sensor having pre-existed before the Silverstone WEC race. Now, whether or not you, I, or anybody else finds that a credible position, frankly, doesn't matter. That is the position that actually stood. The punishment that was meted out was to remove all the points for the season for the teams. So it was deemed to be extremely serious. if you're asking me my opinion, I think that indicates that the stewards and race officials certainly feel there was a longer standing potential for that issue, and were certainly thoroughly unimpressed by the reaction of the team in not only failing to cooperate with the investigation, but actually standing in its way. That does not stand well against, frankly, a team I hold in high regard. It is not a good thing on the record there, I'm afraid, at all. I'll say this. I wrote, and many of you may well have written, may well have read, a piece analysing what we might have seen in those first 50 places that we actually eventually saw 42. I made a conscious decision not to put in there that there was some doubt in my mind as to whether or not the ACO might remove one of those automatic entries, because there is always, as with all of the regulations for these things, it is an invitation race. The ACO actually don't need to give a reason why they're not. It's exactly the same, for instance, with Ginetta. They don't need to give a reason why they're not actually going to invite you to their race. The reality is that one of those two Ginettas was a full season WEC entry, and if the relevant fines for not turning up were paid up, it would remain a full season WEC entry, other than the fact there was a catch-all rule which effectively says we can decide what we're going to do on any given day for whatever reason. So they haven't opted in this instance to exercise that right. Quite whether or not they've decided the penance is now paid for proton competition, I would kind of edge towards an explanation here. This has been a long-standing, loyal entrant in multiple competitions with multiple cars of very high quality, and with, well, at least some tacit factory backing from Porsche, with factory drivers and factory junior drivers learning their endurance spurs there. I'd like to be able to say that at the end of this season, I'd like to be able to draw a line under this one. I'd also like an open conversation with Christian Reed and his people about what actually happened there. I suspect we're not going to get that for quite some time to come.
Well, why don't we let's have a little bit of fun before we maybe sprinkle in some SRO and IMSA to run out the clock here. I'll grab two quickly while my voice is returning a little bit. One comes in from Adam Weller, who says, Judd V10s will always be the soundtrack of 2000s Le Mans style racing in my mind. What car do you associate most with the GV4 and its relatives? So this might be a bit of an odd one, but granted, the Judd was kind of the thing that made cars, different cars that didn't necessarily have it intended as its original power plant run. But I guess I think of the Doran Racing, I think it was Grand Am, 2000-ish, or maybe it was ALMS, but their Dallara chassis.
That was 2002.
2002. And I'm also thinking of having seen, I believe it was one of the, possibly a Momo entered, I might be wrong on the entrant, Ferrari 333 SP with the Judd V10 bolted in the back of it here in North America. So those, oddly, are the ones that stand out to me. I'll grab this other one, Graham, from Ryan Terpstra, who says, is the BTCC, British Touring Car Championship, and World Touring Car Championship considered sports cars? I know the BTCC series can have some epic races. I don't recall the two series ever being discussed here, though, on the Week in Sports Cars. If the answer is no, why not? This is a great one, Ryan, and thank you for asking. So, a former colleague of mine, someone who's very, very anal, I remember listening to him tell me that, no, touring cars are that. That's why they're called touring cars. They're not sports cars because they're this, that, and the other. And I said, look, they are sports cars. What are they? They are either production-based. In this instance, they're production-based racing vehicles that are converted into racing spec, and they go sports car racing. It's whether you call them touring cars, whether you have something that's called GT Grand Touring, whether you call them a Le Mans prototype. There's all kinds of different acronyms, but they all come back to the same thing. It is a sports car, and sports being the thing that we've used to delineate the difference between, say, a stock car, that being a NASCAR type vehicle, or say an Indy car, open wheel, Formula One, open wheel. So, yes, BTCC, WTCC, anything that might just be referred to or have the name touring car in its name. Yes, Ryan, in my book, they're all fall under the same blanket of sports cars. And as for why they don't get discussed, I don't know if we've had many questions coming in, and it being those two, well, British touring car, obviously an amazing past. It was my favorite racing series for many, many years, in particular in the very early 90s, most of the 90s. But obviously it's not quite as big as it once was. World Touring Car, boy, there was a couple of highlight years there, Graham, but that to me is a series that, at least today, what it was, what it became, is just something that held no appeal at all.
It fell to pieces. They went with their specialist form of cars that were mightily impressive, but hugely expensive. BTCC, by the way, a big headline this week from the UK. Well, crosses the ocean, doesn't it? Back into your kart days and back into the sports car days back in the past with Mark Blundell, rolling back the years and hopefully not rolling out of Paddock Hill Bend, but stepping back into British national racing with the BTCC program. BTCC, I mean, what I'd say is very much more sprint format, without a doubt, those cars. I do like to see when we get into things like the Gravantic racing, the 24H series, where you've got touring cars, and for that matter VLN, around the Nürburgring, touring cars and GT cars out on track together. I know certainly the new era in the Michelin Pilot Challenge with the TCR cars and the GT4 cars out together, that again has proven to be, I think, something of a hit, and I think we'll go from strength to strength. It is a bit of an odd one, isn't it? Maybe whether or not it's the kind of rear-wheel drive, front-wheel drive, frankly, it's semantics in some ways. Tin Top Racing, they both are. There tend to be very polarized fan bases, certainly across Europe, for the two codes of racing. But there are some crossovers, and the more the merrier as far as I'm concerned. Let's have a quick look for a couple in the fun stuff that I'll pick up as well here, MP. Let's have a look for... GG and MP Motorsport are entering the Nürburgring 24 hours. As ever, you need to share garages. You get to pick one team from anywhere in motorsport to share with. You get to veto one team to make sure you don't get stuck with them. Who do you choose or avoid, and why?
Oh, Lord.
That's a cracker. Who would I choose to go with? Who's good fun?
I mean, I think we just avoid Belgians at all costs. I mean, that's kind of an international thing, right? I believe that's in the sporting code. I can't wait to get some nasty letters and emails on that. Whereas the Dutch, I think a Dutch team...
Oh, the Dutch!
Fun. Yeah, that's going to be fun. Boy, but...
the Japanese, they're polite and they'll lend us all the tools. They'd be lovely.
Yeah, I think we're working from a few stereotypes here, my man. And
there's just a touch.
Yeah. How's this? I ain't touching this one because I don't need a me too, them too, us too. We're avoiding all kind of. Yeah, come on, man.
You know what? I've been to well into double figures in terms of Nürburgring 24-hour races, and one of the ones that was actually a pretty touching scene was there was the mix between the Lexus Gazoo Racing, before Toyota Gazoo Racing was a thing, literal factory team from Toyota, and the same from Aston Martin shared a garage one year, and that was actually really good to see because you had pretty senior people. Andy Palmer from it's Ulrich Betts actually at the time from Aston Martin, Toyota-san from Toyota, in the same garage with their guys, preparing cars and just enjoying going racing. What you don't want in that situation is ego to get in the way. Ego plus tiredness plus a little bit of aggression plus machine tools, bad mix, and heat and anger and all of that kind of stuff, and beer, not good mix. Generally speaking,
No, hey, that's apparently that is someone someone has heard us recording and is asking why we're throwing all kinds of stereotypes around. So I think that's the issue there. But go ahead, go ahead. We'll just leave that in. Why? Because that's how we roll, people. That's how we roll.
Could be a special guest. It could be anybody. Could be Christoph Bouchou coming around for a chat.
Boys and girls.
There you go. Let's have a looky here. Shay Adam. If you could have any animated character as your sidekick at a race, which one would you pick and why? She says, I think it's she, Puss in Boots, Shay, would do well in our paddock because I feel a lot of drivers try to emulate his bravado. I'm not sure that if you went into the IMSA paddock, Shay, and tried to find drivers that would actually say, yes, my role model is Puss in Boots, that is necessarily a thing. There might be a fair few that actually would emulate with Donkey or even Shrek. Brian Willman. Oh, there you go. But which animated character? There's an obvious one to pick because it's actually a cartoon character based on someone beloved from the sports car paddock, and that's Doc from Cars, because of course that back in the day was Paul Newman.
Oh, well, I would go with Foghorn Leghorn because I would just be. There's a part of me that thinks that although my father was from the deep south here in America, there's definitely a part of me that thinks that had I been born in the deep south, I would probably have far too much in common with good old Mr. Foghorn Leghorn. So, yeah, he's a riot, I tell ya. All right, well, we got some IMSTA. Someone please write that down. It's a new word, IMSTA. Should we go with IMSTA or should we go with SORO?
Let's go a bit with SRO and wrap up with IMSA this week. Let's have a few of the SRO questions. You want me to pick a couple?
Brothers, this is all you.
Right, well, David Faulkner asks, referring back to the comments from
Damien, because I would be very disappointed if Damien was sending in questions because he should have better things to do.
He should know the answers anyway, let's face it.
Well, no, he's not very smart, but I'm just saying,
really?
The fact that he would try and type,
but good
that would be cute. Very true, very true.
Yeah. He's referring back to, this is David, not Damien, by the way, referring back to the comments made by Stefan Rattel in series of interviews still to be completed. I've got one for early next week to do with Stefan's thoughts on the changes that have actually come in his packages in North America. Some comments he made regarding GT3 minimum builds, how we discussed them in reference to Corvette, to Lexus, Nissan, etc. David's interpretation was that if a manufacturer is unable to meet the minimum car build and sales, they should look to go to GTE, GTLM. Well, that was not. That was actually what Stefan said. He was saying, really, if you can't make the minimum, which I think is 10 cars built in year 1, 20 by year 2 of homologation, that you should consider looking at GTE, GTLM. David says, admittedly, he has no idea how much it would cost. Surely a move up for Lexus and Nissan wouldn't be too hard, given they can borrow from some of their Super GT programs. Corvette could stay, no worries, if that was the case. It's not quite that simple. On the face of it, it was a very interesting answer. The change, of course, would be, for the most part, that you would be changing what is currently almost a completely pure customer program for a manufacturer for GT3, very few factory cars in GT3, to something which would be effectively a factory funded program. And not only a factory funded program, but because you're then talking about IMSA and or the WEC, these are not cheap factory programs. These are significant expenditures. So effectively, in company financial terms, corporate financial terms, you're talking about something that starts on the basis as a GT3 program as being a potential profit center to being something which is a cost center. That is a major transition, and that means a very much more difficult conversation with the suits in the boardroom, not very many of whom are going to be sympathetic in this day and age to a motorsport program. So on the face of it, yes, it opens up some interesting possibilities. The reality of that, though, for instance, the reality of Nissan transferring a GT3 customer racing program into a factory-funded GT LM GT Pro program, I would suggest to you, is about nil, right now. Bearing in mind they are funding literally nothing outside of Japan, aside from the Formula E effort right now. So who might be in the market for that kind of transition could be a rather more interesting conversation. So the question really needs to be asked of the manufacturers: Have you built 10? Have you built 20 in year year 1 and year 2? And there are a few, you've mentioned a couple of them, that are going to be scrabbling around for that. Callaway most certainly are going to be in that marketplace without a shadow of a doubt. The one that I'm actually increasingly concerned about is Lexus. Not huge numbers of those cars around. I think there's 2 or 3 active at the moment in Japan. There's 2 active in North America. There are 2 now announced with the Panis Barthez competition efforts in Europe. That might rise to 3, maybe 4, but you're struggling to get towards 10, let alone 20, and then you get into what do the regulations actually say? Do they say you've got to build them, or do they say you've got to race them? Because that might be the defining reason behind it. But watch for that, by the way, across the sports car racing media over the next couple of years, about who is saying what about what cars they're selling. One make, by the way, that I think is beginning to make inroads is Honda. And the recent announcement by Jenson Button and his pal Chris Buncombe joining forces with Team RJN in the UK for their new JB Rocket effort in Blancpain. I think you're going to see that one grow and grow. And that is a good example of Honda gaining a high-profile customer with one of their brand ambassadors. Watch, I think, for a little bit more of that as they try to play the numbers game.
I think we have time for 1, maybe 2 more questions, my friend. Why don't you grab whatever interests you from good old IMSA, and then we will set this episode in flight and hopefully enjoy a fine weekend ahead.
Well, let's go for one from Dan, who says he basically might be coming down to Sebring. Any travel advice, airports to fly into, how do you get to the circuit, how long does it take on race day? Please and thank you. Well, it depends where you're coming from, but any of the major airports in the region, Tampa and Orlando are the favourite, but certainly Miami is certainly doable, albeit it's a longer trip from there. Daytona
Fort
Beach
Myers is another one that some folks like to use.
But they're all doable. You will need a car. It's a chunky little drive. Traffic in the area on race day in particular, depending on which race it is you're coming to see, is going to be significant. Significant queues at the gates. There will be, I'm sure, tickets on the gates, but significant queues in that area. The infrastructure, particularly as it gets close to race time, with some changes this year, of course, in terms of how the parking is going to work because of the more crowded paddock. So I know, for instance, we media are being encouraged, are we not, Marshall Pruitt, to arrive in the very early morning and walk across the track, the cold track, before the track action actually starts, without which we're going to be in for a pretty long shuttle ride. So keep an eye out on the Sebring circuit website, on the IMSA website, on the WC website for instruction, but you will be more than welcome. It is, I think, going to be a spectacular weekend. It's going to be a spectacularly busy weekend for the likes of you and me, MP.
And I would say, yeah, a lot of the answers to your question, Dan, are very easily Googleable. I'll grab a couple here, and then maybe we'll say farewell. This one from Scuba Diver John. In your opinions, is a negative outcome for Mazda at the Rolex 24 a fluke? Do they have a strong base to stand on for the season, or is there something missing that prevents them from hitting that top step when it really matters? I'm skeptical of the inline four-cylinder engine and personally view it more as a liability that inhibits the other gains Yost and Mazda have made. Just filed a fairly in-depth story from the next issue of Racer Magazine. Good old Scuba Diver John on this topic, and looking forward a little bit. And from what Mazda Motorsports Director John Doonan told me, the post-race analysis found that there was actually an assembly error inside the engine of the number 77 Mazda, the one that failed while running thereabouts the lead, the pole-sitting car, record-setting car that failed and was afire for a little while. So apparently it was an actual human physical assembly internally within that motor that caused the problem. I'd say this, and this is also a pretty central point of the feature, it's that, yes, so far they've yet to prove they can get to the end of a 24-hour race without interruption and in a competitive place. So that is the big mountain for them left to climb, obviously. The thing that I am encouraged by, and I believe they are encouraged by, though, John, is if you think about the remainder of the calendar, obviously we have a 12-hour at Sebring, but if you look at how long the car ran before that motor problem and how long the Sister 55 ran, it did have some issues. It got hit, had some electrical issues, but if you think about the remainder of the races, I think those cars are going to be very fast and should be, from a reliability standpoint, well within their window of tolerance. So still have to get that Daytona monkey off their back, but I would say just about everywhere else, I think the rest of the DPI competitors have a genuine reason to be concerned. So don't be surprised if IMSA is doing some BOP work to actually pull them back a little bit as we get into some of those races. Quickly here, Pete RH305 says, Marshall, I'm feeling nostalgic. Is there any chance IMSA would bring back a showroom stock racing series similar to the old Firehawk series, Motorola Cup, Coney Challenge, etc.? And then says, I know the Michelin Cup is a modern version, but it seems that with GT4 and TCR-based rule set requires large budgets and eliminates a lot of the variety and creativity. I completely agree. I've been saying it for years and have been saddened for years that take any of the, I shouldn't say any, most of the entrants in the modern Michelin Cup series, and they're aftermarket. Many of them are aftermarket businesses, ones who specialize in a certain mark and make all kinds of go-fast bits for it. And the thing that worked so well was the ability to say, hey, we're going to go to Daytona, we're going to go to wherever, and develop a new braking kit, develop a new suspension piece, something on a model that they built at home and that applies directly to what their customers would want. And it would genuinely be race-proven, and that certainly would help them from a sales standpoint. Now, you have a lot of teams that just have to buy a car off the proverbial shelf. And I fear, Graham, that if this is the accepted road for too long, the days of folks actually saying, I'm going to go turn my Honda Accord into, I believe we have... Scott Tucker is at the door, boys.
Wow!
Yes, well, in the waiting room now with Christophe Bouchou. Pretty awesome to see our friends show up. They're now at level 6, apparently. I would say the concern here is once you go down the spec route long enough, you start to lose either knowledge or just the custom of folks actually buying a road-based vehicle, modifying it themselves, installing just making a race car from a bare shell and bringing it to the racetrack. So if we are just truly veering towards the way in pro racing of everything is homologated, just call so-and-so, send them a bank transfer and the car shows up. It's great for teams that don't have a lot of knowledge and or teams that don't really have anything to promote. They just want to go racing. But for the aftermarket industry, which has really been a big part of American culture and I think European culture, when you lose that conduit at the racetrack to do that, that concerns me long term for sure.
It just kind of begs the question whether or not there is a gap in the marketplace. The problem, of course, and it's long been a problem with global motorsport, particularly with continental motorsport in North America, because the distances are what they are. It's a shame, really, that in the era where SRO are now involved with the World Challenge product, that what they've chosen for their regional rather than continental product is a standardized GT4 product. There is that opportunity there, surely, for somebody, for some kind of modified production regional championship. I know that it does exist, obviously, in SCCA, NASA, etc. with some of the more junior kind of packages. But I tend to agree with you. It's one of the things that was just such a joy to wander around a paddock and think, oh, didn't know they'd done that with that. Look at that. Look at that, a Toyota Starlet with 4 V8 engines stuffed into the glove compartment. But the part of that joy has certainly gone away from international level motorsport. Still there in some, to some smaller degree in some kind of national packages around the world, but increasingly we're subject, aren't we, to the kind of the corporate dollar and customer sport and on all of that. And look, I love TCR and I like GT4 and I like GT3 and all of that. I don't want those things to go away, but you're absolutely right. There's more and more doors being slammed shut in the faces of those that look to do something a little bit rebellious. I keep going back in these instances to conversations, no, let's call them what they were, arguments back in the day between the likes of Martin Short at Roll Centre Racing, and by the way, Adam Weller, it's Shorty's efforts in the Roll Centre Delara and the Pescarolo that are the ones for me with the Judd, because they were just, that little bit left field. That his conversations with Stefan Rattel back in the day when SRO had just taken over the British GT package, Shorty always wanted to come with something left field and always wanted to do his own thing. And we had this remarkable stream of cars that emerged from Roll Centre Racing with the TVR Cerbera Speed 6, the first ever car in the world, by the way, to top a class win in what is now kind of GT level racing that wasn't a Porsche, was that car. Later on with the little Noble M12 in the GT Cup class, the Mosler, which Shorty and his guys brought to international competition and took all over the world, raced those cars at the Bathurst 12 Hour, came and brought those cars back and raced them at the Rolex 24 Hours at Daytona. And I can recall a conversation from Martin Short with Stefan Rattel where Shorty was there bidding for, come on, give us a chance with these wacky cars. And he was saying he can't understand why people just don't go out and buy a Ferrari or a Porsche. To which the answer is, of course, because we want to do something different. And that is definitely going away. And I think that's something that we should bitterly regret. One quick thing, by the way, because I'm on that kind of tangent. Martin Short, Roll Centre Racing, Lola, that was originally going to be where we got the Bentley Continental GT3 from. And it was only with Lola actually going away at that point that deal went elsewhere, and of course went over to M Sport, Graham Hathaway, the guys that actually produced the fabulous Continental GT3 first generation car that we got at that point.
Well, before I ask you to say farewell, since you said hello to start the show, I'll mention that thank you to everyone for allowing us this two-parter this week. Just from a time standpoint, we did not have extended time on Wednesday when we recorded part one. Actually, nor do we have all that much extended time here. We'll also mention, Graham, that I am staring at 4 samples from our dear friends at TorontoMotorsports.com. Of new updated 2019 Week in Sports Cars logo on fine graphite t-shirts, and we haven't revealed the logo yet to folks. We will on March 1st. Graham has seen the change to the logo. I think I mentioned we have changed the manufacturer of the P2 car, and the livery itself is a throw-forward livery, which I hope folks are going to love. So that might be something that folks actually want to buy from our dear friends at TorontoMotorsports.com. And I'm also looking at the brand new logo, never before seen logo for Inside the Sports Car Paddock. Which, yeah, I know you enjoy that one, and I do too. And it's using a GT car, and so I hope folks are going to love and want to pick some of those up, because our dear friend Roger Warwick has done a smashing job on coming up with some new 2019 swag with your beautiful face and my whatever face on those logos.
I think let's put it this way: we've got because it's fair to say, MP, that the recent rigours of international travel and national travel for you have taken their toll on both of us. So we've had our challenges about keeping this podcasting to a timetable the last couple of weeks. That'll get back onto track, I'm sure, with both of us on the road to recovery. I'll be on the road again, though, next week, Wednesday, flying off to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia for the finale of the Asia Le Mans series, and I'm hoping to be able to pull together a bit of an Inside the Sports Car Racing Paddock special from there. That should bring us bang up to date with what's actually going on with the Asia Le Mans series turning towards Australia, because right now there is a high-powered delegation for the Asia Le Mans series touring Australia, talking to not just the people down at the bend, but also to teams about that might want to be kind of considering joining that little package. So we'll have something from the fabulous continent of Asia for you next week, as well as, I'm sure, contributions to UMP about issues of the day. For now, though, we're going to let Marshall Pruitt go and answer the door, because by now Christophe Boucher is going to be furious, and Scott Tucker will probably be picking his pockets. So it's time for us to say farewell, to say thank you again for all of you from Twitter, from Reddit, from the Facebook groups, for providing those fantastic questions. Thanks, of course, to the fabulous people at Cooper Tyres, and the equally, if not more so, fabulous people at the Justice Brothers, our backers for the Week in Sports Cars. I've been Graham Goodwin. He's been a sniffly Marshall Pruitt. It's a thank you, and for the second time this week, good night.